Alright, today we're going to talk about my SR38 Bleed Mystic here. It's got a lot of benefits from the new FoA and the stuff that works with the Berserker, especially Bone Chilling Cry. We're going to run through the stats first here. We're running 28, 25, and then 33, 27 for the offensive and defensive ability. Now you might think that the OA here is a bit low. However, it doesn't matter as much as you would think because a lot of the skills that we have are going to be bleed based and they're going to be proccing so often that if your critical hit ability is only in the low 10s to 15s, you're still going to get all of those procs off before cooldowns usually happen. And because we have a slightly lower offensive ability, that gives us a higher defensive ability that we can use to survive in the higher SR realms when we're getting attacked by swarms of monsters. For our armor, we're running 3169. We've got 100% absorption here. As for our resistances, we are overcapped on everything, with the Aether and Vitality being probably the lowest. And before anybody gets crazy and says that 9% physical resist is ridiculous, I agree, it is. But however, when you use the Blood of Dreeg and the Rallying Cry, which are both 60-second duration skills, they're always on, it goes up to 25. So we really have 25 as a whole. Just a heads up here. For some reason in Grim Tools, it doesn't have the Crimson Moon set in there. So when you open up the link, you're going to see that we're missing the hands, the shoulders, the chest, and the necklace. I'm not sure what's going on with it. I know at some point it will probably be updated, but that's just something to be aware of, that the numbers are going to look totally different because it's missing a large portion of the entire build. Let's start with the legs here. We have the leg guards of Crimson Snow, and mainly because of the +2 to Bloody Pox and the reduced entrapment duration. As a whole, this is one of those places where you kind of just fit in the best thing that you can find. For the chest piece and the set we're going to be using, it's going to be the Crimson Moon set. And the bonuses, if we look at these, are going to be +80 to offensive and then +60 to defensive ability. It gives us 200% bleed damage with 100% increased duration, 14% health, and then +3 to Bloody Pox. The 4 set is going to be an additional 10,000 damage to Bloody Pox per second, and then we don't use Recklessness in this or Rip and Tear, so we don't need those. As for the main hand weapon, we're going to be using the Frenzied Slicer of the Abyss. There are a couple other monster infrequent items that work similarly well to this. However, those require a lot of cunning. The best one requires like 560 or 570 cunning, and you really just can't fit it in when you have to do physique and spirit, because this item here requires 724 spirit by itself. So you're spread too thin, so we have to go with this one. This gives us an additional 2600 bleeding damage per second, and then it also reduces the enemy's bleeding resist by another -10%. Then it gives us the Enrage ability, where we're going to have an increased offensive ability, but slightly lower defense and increased attack speed. And this plays very well with the fact that we do run a slightly lower offense than we do defense, because when this triggers, it's going to swap and it's going to level itself out just a little bit more with a higher offense or with a higher defensive ability in total. For the rings here, we're using a double set of the Bloodletter's Weaver Band of the Drangul, primarily for the bleed with the extra duration, but it gives us a nice bit of health and a lot of offensive and defensive ability, plus 12% armor increased. There are some other options that play more along with the skills that this character has. However, these are going to be more geared towards the defensive side of the things, just because we have so much resist reduction that our bleed gets through without an issue, and we don't really need too much extra offense. For the helmet, we're going to be using the Bloodletter's Corpse Cask of the Drangul, so very similar to the rings that we have. And this is going to give us, again, another big chunk of health, offensive and defensive ability, another increase to our armor, and then for Curse of Frailty, it gives a further -10% bleeding reduction. The amulet is going to be part of the Crimson Moon. It gives +1 to all Berserker and Occultist skills. Then it gives an additional 4,100 bleeding damage per second to Bloody Pox, and then a further -10% reduction to the bleeding resist. For the offhand, we're going to be using the Mythical Ravener's Skull, And I would say this is another pretty important part. It gives us a ton of bleeding damage with a huge duration increase. And then it gives us +3 to Bone Chilling Cry and +3 to Wasting, which are going to be two of our skills to cut the resist down. And it's going to give us 3,500 bleeding damage per second to Curse of Frailty, then another -8% bleeding reduction. Then to Bloody Pox, it's going to give another 6,000 damage per second. And then to Bone Chilling Cry, we're going to get another 4,500 bleed damage per second and another -10% bleeding resists. So you can really see we haven't even made it to the skills yet, and all of these bleeding resists are really stacking up. For the shoulders, we're going to be using the Crimson Moon as well. This gives a +2 to Bloody Pox and Curse of Frailty. For the hands, we have the Crimson Moon as well. This is going to give us an additional 5,300 to Bloody Pox. And then for the boots, we have a personal favorite, the Stonehide, Stoneplate, Greaves of the King. Tons of defensive ability here, and that's the main reason that we use it. For the metal, we're going to be using the Bloodletters, Feast Mark of the Drangul. So this is going to give us a lot of offensive and defensive ability, an increase to our armor, and some bleeding with duration. But again, it does modify Bloody Pox to give another 4,100 damage per second. And then for the belt, I have the Reforged Chains of Oleron. This gives us some good crit damage and some bleeding damage, plus a little bit of vitality resist. But the main reason we use it is the +2 to leap. There are probably some other options here, but I haven't really looked too hard because this is what's working right now. If I do decide to try to push this any higher into 39 and 40, I think the belt will be the first thing that we change. And then for the last thing, we have Amotop's Grip. This gives us some bleeding damage and then good offensive and defense, plus 1 to all Berserker as well. And then the Grasp skill gives a bleeding damage increase by 225, plus 100% duration, and then some flat bleeding damage, plus attack speed. So that's the gear summary. Let's jump over to the skills and devotions. We'll jump into the Occultist first here. We're going to be using a 1+1 in Witchfire, and then a full 12+1 into Second Right. And then we have a 12+1 into Possession. This is going to give us a 28% damage absorption. This is a very important skill to have, just for general survivability. And then we have Bloody Pox. This is the powerhouse of the build. We have a 10+10 in it, and then we have it being modified by Falcon Swoop, which is going to give another 20,000 bleed damage over 3 seconds. To modify this, we have Wasting with a 11+7. It's going to give 216% bleeding damage and then -200% offensive ability. And what that's going to do is it's going to really make it much harder for the enemies to hit you. So while we might not have as much standard defense as some of the more tanky builds have, we are going to be getting hit less often. And that's really going to play out into the higher ranks. Then the last thing is going to be Black Death with a 12+4. It's going to give us more bleeding and duration, but a 34% chance to confuse the target. Moving down, we have Curse of Frailty, and this is going to be the first big reduction that we use. It's going to be a -51% to bleeding resist, and it's going to be modified by Howl, which is going to give us more bleed damage over 3 seconds, plus more percentage bleed, and then reduce the target's defensive ability by 144. It's also going to give us some casting speed and some attack speed. We have 1+1 here in vulnerability. This is just going to give them a -30% defensive ability, and that's the main reason that we use it. Moving over, we have a 1+1 in Blood of the Dreeg, just to have the skill in general, but the important part here is Aspect of the Guardian. This is going to give us 16% physical resist, which is incredibly important later on. So that's going to wrap up the Occultist. Now we'll move on to the Berserker. There's really not as much in this line as there is for the Occultist. So we have an 8+2 for the Bloody Fangs for the bleeding damage. And then we're going to have a 12+4 into Leap. This is one of our main active abilities. The other ones that we use for like the bleeding damage over time, they have a long duration, so we don't need to spam them. But this one, we can continue to spam over and over again as an active skill. We're going to have it modified by Fault Line, which is going to increase the bleeding damage again. Going down, we have a 1+2 in Onslaught, mainly so that we can trigger open wounds, which is going to give us more bleeding damage and then reduce the target's damage. It's going to be modified by Endless Rage for a little bit of the extra bleeding damage and duration, but a +3 to our Onslaught stacks. Then moving all the way down, we have a 7+2 in Battle Surge for defensive sustain. And then we have an 11+2 and Untamed Rage for some sustain as well. So when we drop below 50%, we're going to get a 34% damage absorption. And this is going to give us a chance to get out if we get sundered or if we get nullified. And that's going to wrap up our skills for the Occultist and the Berserker. We'll jump over to our devotions now. So starting off, we keep the top and right side for the Crossroads. Then we have Tortoise modifying our Possession. We come down and we have Falcon, which is going to modify our Bloody Pox. We have Bat, which is going to modify our Onslaught. We have Ghoul modifying our Pact. We have the Behemoth modifying our Soulless Witchfire. And then we have Fox here, Quill here, and the Night Talon over there. Moving down, we have the Empty Throne, and then we have the Huntress modifying our Leap, which is going to rend the enemies for another minus 32% bleed reduction. And lastly, we have the Wolf, which is going to be modifying Curse of Frailty and giving more bleed damage and duration. So that wraps up the devotions here. I get a lot of people talking about the fact that I don't use tier 3 devotions, and that's a very conscious choice because you get a lot more mileage out of using a lot of tier 2 devotions than you do fully committing to tier 3 and then having to use a weird pathway that doesn't directly benefit your build in order to attain the tier 3 stuff. So with this build, what we're going to do is we're going to have Q and W up at all times. These are our 60-second skills. And then when we jump in, we're going to leap on them first. Then we're going to use Curse of Frailty, which is going to give them minus 51% bleed resist. Then we're going to use our 1, 2, and 3. So 1 is going to be Bone Chilling Cry with the bleeding resist. This is where we use Bloody Pox now to get all the damage through. And then we use the Dread Wake for more bleeding damage. And now we can continue to use our Onslaught stacks and occasionally trigger our Leap again once our Onslaught stacks are built up. So this is what that looks like as a whole. Just like this. And it's a pretty simple rotation once you get in there. You do have to be mindful of not spamming too many skills that you don't need because it will drain your energy reservoir, but it really shouldn't be a problem, especially if you're not using the Rallying Cry and the Blood of Dreeg when you don't need to. Alright, so that's the applications done. Let's jump into SR38 and see how we do. All right, we made it out there. So you can really see one of the strong aspects of this build is the fact that you don't have to engage too hard on enemies. You can go in, you can proc all of your stuff, you can hit them with a little bit of onslaught and then proc a really heavy leap, and then you can jump out. And then while you're out, you can have the bleed tick down because the duration is so long. You can kite a lot of things, and they'll just die on your screen while you're engaging another group of enemies, and then you just continue to do that. So you jump in, proc all your abilities, get the bleed going, and then you move on to the next pack. That way you're not taking damage from a ton of enemies at once, but they're slowly dying off behind you. If I had to rate this build, this is a solid 10 out of 10 build. This is my favorite build right now. I think it's just so much fun to play, and there's a lot to kind of juggle. You have to be aware of your two long duration skills and keep those up. You have to be aware of your onslaught stacks and when you use that with leap. You have to make sure that you cycle your resist down when they're going to expire on the enemy, so keeping those up. And then you also have to be aware of your energy reservoir because if you just spam all your skills, you will drain your reservoir, and that will put you in a bad spot because none of your abilities will be active. So as always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.